Adam,
Yeah,
can
we
you
are.
just confirm that?
Yep, good to go, Tim.
Okay, so speaking of the spring, we conducted our Battle of the Atlantic Gala dinner here in Ottawa, and I want to certainly thank the sponsors who chipped in and supported us for that dinner, because they're also supporting the Naval Affairs program over the course of the year. So sponsors, once again, thank you for your support. Everyone, you can see the great people who stepped up, supported the dinner, sponsored the dinner, and as I say, as well as our own Naval Affairs program throughout the year. Here's just a couple of photographs of the event that night for those of you who were there or were not, perhaps give you an idea of what a great evening it was. Certainly, there were two people who stole the show. I would say that the Minister of National Defense and our Master of Ceremonies, they certainly stole the show in my mind. It was a great evening thanks to them. You can see the pictures depict a great evening of dining, group get-togethers, group discussions, drinks beforehand, chats with members of Parliament, and one picture there depicts the cadets that joined us from RMC, and I was quite pleased that we were able to host them for the evening. Moving on to other activities in the Naval Affairs program, we're getting things up and running now in the fall. And we want to advertise a few things and let people know that these are available if you are interested in purchasing them. Someone suggested perhaps they would make great Christmas gifts, so now is the time to consider that. The one on the left, obviously, is our volume 11 of Salty Dips, produced about a year and a half ago. We have copies that are available, as well as the graphic novel on the right, which we printed around the time of the dinner. Unfortunately, it wasn't fully available to sell back then, but it is now, and you can order a copy of it online at our website, as well as the Salty Dips Volume 11. We've got an issue of Star Shell coming up, which Adam's been working on over the summer months, preparing for it. It'll be out in October. As well, Adam's been working on an online conference for potentially November, and the subject of that will be NORAD renewal, maritime dimension. So I think that will get people's attention. It's been, over the course of the summer, we didn't see a defense policy
May
update.
I leave the dishes to you?
Yep.
Please turn off your microphone.
Are you hearing this by any chance?
Only very
Yeah.
faintly.
Okay, it probably comes through my headphones then.
Yeah.
So the last thing I want to mention is the Admiral's Medal. You'll recall around this time last year, we put out the call for solicitations. Those deserving people who from the audience tonight who could or should or may be worthy of recognition for their contributions to maritime affairs, not just within the Naval Association, but across the country. So if you've got somebody that you think might fit that mold, please look on the Naval Association's national website. You can find the description of what the selection criteria are. You can also find the nomination forms, and we're obviously looking for new nominations this year, which would precipitate or lead to an award, hopefully in the spring of 2024. So the selection process takes effect over the fall, and we have the presentation in 2024. So please look into that while you're on the Naval Association's website. A couple more quick slides. I want to mention one other thing that Naval Affairs has been involved in over the last couple of months of the summer, and that's the Royal Canadian Navy's mentorship program. I'll let you read these bullets. In effect, what we're doing is supporting the RCN with its own initiative, a mentorship program to support sailors that are currently serving and new sailors who will be joining potentially over the next year or two. Everyone knows that the RCN is having some HR challenges, and we think it's important within the Naval Association that we do the best we can, as much as we can, to help them get over that the challenges that they're facing these days, particularly with recruitment and retention. So again, I'll let you read that slide. And the next one just gives you an idea, well, why is NAC, the Naval Association, interested in this? Well, it's all about our own membership. We've experienced declines over the last 5 years. It's becoming more and more obvious. Our numbers are dwindling. We need to rekindle the interest in the organization, and we see the mentorship program as potentially an opportunity to do that. There are member benefits to, obviously, to members of the RCN, from perhaps connecting up with some of us folks who served in the RCN, giving our sage advice and offering them some of our experiences. At the same time, getting them interested in what the Naval Association is all about, and hopefully having them join us as members. So in terms of the process, we're looking now, the RCN, we had a discussion this morning with them. They're learning about the software that is used to facilitate this kind of a program. They're going to make a decision on which software it is that they would want to purchase for a pilot program. That's their responsibility. And if and when the project goes forward, that's when they'll call us and say, yes, we'd like some Naval Association support as mentors. So stand by for more information on that if and when things move forward over the winter months. So turning now to our evening for our guest speaker, I just want to quickly go over the rules of engagement on this slide. We want to keep everyone muted to avoid background noise. So please mute yourself and leave yourself muted throughout the presentation. Turn off your video as well, because it just means that other people are getting distracted by whatever you're up to as you're watching the presentation. Put your questions in the chat function, and I will moderate and ask questions of the guest speaker towards the end of the presentation. We will record this event as we're doing so now, and we'll shut it off just before we get into the Q&A. And subject to our speaker's approval, this is a standard process that we go through. We will make the recording available to those who attended a few days after the event. And finally, last but not least, we are under Chatham House rule of non-attribution for any and all of our speakers' evenings. That means whatever is discussed in this forum, please, it stays in this forum and is not attributed anywhere outside this forum. So now, without further ado, I will ask Adam Lajeunesse to introduce our guest speaker, a good friend of mine from many years back, Dr. Rob Huebert. Adam, over to you.
Well, thank you, Tim. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rob Huebert, a close colleague of mine and actually a former graduate supervisor. Dr. Huebert is a full professor of political science at the University of Calgary, and only this month took on the directorship of the Center for Military and Strategic Studies, also housed at the U of C. He's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a research fellow with the Global Affairs Institute. From 2010 to 2015, he served as a member of the Canadian Polar Commission, now Canada Polar Knowledge. Dr. Huebert is one of Canada's most well-respected and widely published and active scholars working in the fields of Arctic security, maritime security, and Canadian defense more broadly. His work appears in many academic journals, of course, but he's also one of the first stops for journalists writing on the subject, giving him a considerable influence in the public understanding of Canadian security. His recent op-ed for the Globe and Mail titled "China is on a relentless mission to control Canada's Arctic waters" is a good example of that, having stirred up debate and been circulated very widely. Today, I'm very pleased to have Dr. Huebert with us to discuss the broad geopolitical shifts in the global security, how these are shaping Canadian defense policy, and perhaps how they're not shaping it enough. Rob, welcome, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, and thank you, Tim. It is indeed my pleasure to be able to address this august body. I have a strong affection for the great work that the NAC does, going all the way back to the days of Fred Ricard and Peter Hayden when I was just a grad student at Dalhousie University. And so it is indeed an honor for me to be here. You'll have to excuse my space-looking glasses right now. I suspect that a few of you might recognize this as sort of a post-cataract operation requirement. So I'm not trying to marshal my inner Elliot Gould. I just, unfortunately, if I'm facing a screen, I have to wear these cool-looking shades. I'd also like to take the time to honor a very strong friend of the Navy, who, of course, all of you will be aware have passed. Hugh Segal was one of those rare individuals. He was a politician that understood sea power, probably one of the very few that actually did. I was very saddened to see his death. And indeed, Navy and those that are friends of the Navy lost a very strong voice for things Navy and sea power in Canada. Now, I'm very happy to come here and share some ideas on some what I see as a developing core issue for Canada. Now, obviously, everybody in this group is particularly well versed with understandings of sea power and what that means going into the future, but it's not one of those sort of peripheral issues that just because all of us have a collective interest, either having served in the Navy or studied the Navy, that we are interested in that esoteric term, Canadian sea power. But rather, I'm here to make the argumentation that as we move forward into the future international system, this is going to be critical to Canadian security. We have entered into an era of a return of great power conflict, not competition, not adversaries, but in my estimation, conflict. And Navy and naval power will be at the center of much of this coming conflict, both with the Russians and with the Chinese. Therefore, it's of imperative importance that the West understands sea power, and Canada, as a member of the collective security of the Western system, needs to understand it too. But we face huge difficulties in moving forward. I am just going to call up my share on the screen. Okay, so what is the problem? I'll be blunt here. And by the way, I don't mind if you quote me outside of this. I know the rules of the forum is for non-attribution. Anything I say, I will stand by, and I will stand by it publicly. I do believe that conflict is coming. I think that conflict has become quite clear since the early 2000s and even possibly before that. And that is because of the changing geopolitical world environment. At the heart of this coming conflict will be sea power and how sea power is utilized by the main combatants. And the main combatants, of course, as we all understand, will be the Americans and their allies and friends, as well against the Russians and the Chinese. Canada cannot be neutral. This may be the pipe dream of some Canadians, and I would argue some Canadian political elites, but we cannot be neutral. Even for us to suggest that we would somehow stand aside on a conflict either in the European sector or in the Indo-Pacific region simply cannot be, given our economic connections to the Americans, let alone our alliance commitments that exist. The environmental maritime threat is also going to be increasing. There's no question whatsoever of the impacts that we are seeing being caused to maritime security because of the changes of climate change. This is going to be influencing how we understand the geopolitical threats. It will be an intervening variable, but I will make the argumentation that is critical of the environmental threat that we are now facing. The geopolitical threat becomes even magnitude of several magnitudes above the environmental security threat. Both of them are existential threats to Canadian security, but I'm here to talk about the geopolitics. The problem that we face is that Canadian political leadership, with very few exceptions, and once again, the late Hugh Segal was one exception, does not understand nor care to understand elements of sea power and what that requires of them and of Canada. Now, what is the new threat? Well, the new threat is quite clear. It is the new geopolitical challenges. We have a renewed Russian assertiveness, Russian assertiveness, I would argue, many people, such as our former Minister of Foreign or Global Affairs, suggested changed in February 2022. That cannot be more wrong. We started seeing these changes on the European side as early as 1999 to 2000 with the arrival of Putin as leader of the Russian state. And we can find the indicators of the Chinese intent as early as 1989 with their response to the Tiananmen Square and decision to become a peer competitor to the Americans. And so we have the renewed Russian assertiveness. We have the rise of Chinese power. And we have, of course, the American response. It is a triangle, and it is reactive, and it is long-term. It is not because of what happens in August or February of 2022. These are much more deeper and therefore dangerous interactions that, to a very large degree, we in the West have been ignoring. The second factor that makes the coming conflict so dangerous are weapon system development. Ultimately, what we are seeing on the maritime and the aerospace front is the effort by, first of all, the Chinese and the Russians to have an ability to respond to the American anti-ballistic missile systems that were introduced at the end of the Cold War. But ultimately, what we are seeing is development of delivery systems that are dual purpose, conventional, but nuclear as well, that give the capability of the possibility of a war fighting environment with nuclear weapons. I do not take the threats that Putin has been making lightly, and I suggest we also have to be watching very carefully what the Chinese developments in the armament of their naval forces are moving ahead. There are clear challenges to collective security, both in terms of the standard military capabilities that the Russians and Chinese on the maritime side now face or present to us, but the threat also comes from the very sophisticated efforts to have cyber warfare against us, which of course is a clear effort to be able to divide us as we see the warfare being conducted in terms of social media. Now, the new battlefield, as I would argue, we are developing into a battlefield that will have conventional capabilities, but as we start looking at hypersonics, Poseidons, the other types of systems that we may not know in the public era right now, but we see clearly that as a response to the American superiority in delivery systems in the early 1990s and 2000s, the Russians and Chinese have worked very hard on new delivery systems that, as I said, are double-hatted and are dealing in terms of both stealth and speed capabilities. This has returned us to the environment in which the strategic study analyst Herman Kahn identified as forcing us to think about the unthinkable. So we have the way of war now in 2023. There are still tactical warfighting issues that are advancing, and this is advancements also with the delivery systems that I'm talking about. But we also have to face up to the fact that there is hybrid warfare and cyber warfare. Cyber warfare, of course, is the more insidious warfare, which seeks to weaken us. It seeks to divide us. And this is going to make all of the abilities of us to be able to respond in any war fighting environment, let alone the maritime, that much more difficult. Now, when we think about the rebuilding of Russia, well, as I said, our political elites seem determined to think, at least within Canada, that this does not happen until February of 2022. As I said, we see clearly, Putin tells us he's going to do this at the Munich speech in 2007. And we know the centrality of Russian economics dependency on the Arctic region, particularly when it comes to oil and gas. The Russians resumed long-range bomber patrols in 2007. Their SSBNs resumed patrols in 2008. And in 2002, 2001, we see the Russians dedicating huge amounts of resources to develop these new delivery systems that are to be war fighting. And the focus is on the maritime side. And so we shouldn't be surprised. The Chinese go from having a defense budget that is less than that of Canada in 1989 to one that is now starting to catch the Americans. Yes, I know that there are discussions whether or not they can sustain themselves moving forward in 2023, but they moved from a defense budget of approximately $19 billion in 1989 to one that we think now is probably closer to about $450 billion, moving on the American defense budget of about $680 billion. Now, once again, we always have to be cautious with the numbers, But it's clear when we then look at the third largest defense budget, which is either the Russians or the Saudis, depending on which year you look at recently, at 80 billion. So you understand and appreciate the magnitude of difference here. We've seen that the Russians have been very successful in using military force. Since 2008, they have utilized it as a means of keeping new entries out of NATO. Now, of course, we can turn around and say, but there's been 2 failures with Finland and Sweden, and that is absolutely true. But 2008, I would suggest, was a hardening of Russian resolve to, in fact, to utilize military force in the means that they are now doing within Ukraine. Now, when we look at the Chinese, we know that to a very large degree, they are taking the same page out from their lessons of learning of how America and the United Kingdom became world hegemons and its maritime trade and naval power. Once again, it's not terribly surprising to follow what the Russians are, or what the Chinese are trying to do with their Silk Road initiative, very similar to what the British did when they were at the height of their sea power, and very similar to what the Americans were able to do in the post-Second World War period with their maritime power. And this leads me to the third part that we don't like talking about, and that is, what are the Americans now doing to respond to the response that the Chinese and Russians have had? Well, once again, we see the focus very much on the modernization of their nuclear capabilities, both in terms of deterrence, but also in terms of war fighting. And there is a very strong maritime dimension to what the Americans are doing. It's both in terms of their deterrent, and this audience, I don't have to surprise with the talk that they're not just planning on having the replacement of their Ohios. They've cut steel. The first Columbus class is expected to enter the waters in the next few years. So they've made that decision. They're going ahead. But we also see the Americans are responding. We see this in statements made by General Van Herk when he was head of NORAD and NORTHCOM in terms of being able to meet the Russian threat with a capability of their own. Now, when we think about the new developing maritime environment, of course, events such as the sinking of the Moscow, the cutting of the undersea cables between Svalbard and Norway, all of this alerts us to the new maritime war environment. Now, we have to be cautious with some of the lessons that we are drawing from the Ukrainian-Russian war, because this is in coastal waters. It is an important form of naval warfare and naval power. But of course, what we're not seeing is how the Russians will be engaging with their maritime forces beyond coastal regions. So the entry, of course, of the utilizations of drones, the manner in which the Ukrainians were successful in being able to target the Moscow, all of these are lessons that we need to digest very carefully in the West. The cutting of the undersea cables is also something that I think definitely in Canada we are not prepared for any type of operations of that nature. And this is what part of the reason why I wrote that op-ed about the coming Chinese capabilities of having deep diving submersibles that are Arctic capable, because it creates a clear threat to Canadian Arctic maritime security. So how do we think about Canadian sea power? So we have this new environment, an aggressive Russia, an expansionary China, and new weapon systems that most of us don't like thinking about. It's a chilling topic. Well, there are arguments to thinking against Canadian sea power. And usually these arguments are from those political elites that we can say have saltwater blindness. The argument is that, first of all, why bother thinking about it? Because the Canadian Navy will never operate alone. Also, the requirements that would follow from having that thinking are so difficult, why start in the first place? The international system is changing so rapidly, so why even bother starting? Just depend on the Americans, British, and presumably Australians and Japanese. And also the fact that some would argue, well, the armed forces don't think, they just do, which I find a very insulting argumentation, but nevertheless, you can find it in the statements of some of our political elites. Now, obviously, the arguments, I don't have to convince this group in terms of why we need to be thinking about naval warfare and why we need to be thinking about Canadian sea power is, first and foremost, Canada is a maritime power, maritime nation. And our security, not our maritime security, our security depends on how well we understand that and act upon it. And so that Canadian security depends on a proper understanding of sea power. And that the security of the Western international system, and I would include our friends in the Asia Pacific region as well, depends on maritime security. And therefore, Canada absolutely needs to do this. Isn't discretionary, and yet we act as if it is. Now, why does the Canadian Navy need to be thinking about it? Well, from the domestic perspective, the procurement cycles, as we are all too painfully aware, are very long in Canada. And therefore, we need a long-term vision in terms of how we understand sea power to understand how it is going to be applied. We need to understand the relationship between the Navy and the Canadian public, because we cannot depend on the political elites to ever actually have to be thinking in this context. As I said, one or two exceptions, such as the late Senator Siegel being one. The requirement of the Navy also, inevitably, because of this lack of willingness of our political elites, is that it always has to lead and educate from the back. Even though we know the intellectual power is there with the Navy, and we've seen historically it's capable of doing this, the political structure of our society, of course, means it always has to be behind. You are not going to get a Prime Minister Trudeau coming forward in terms of saying we need to be thinking about sea power and that has to be front and center. That simply will not happen. The international reason why the Navy needs to be thinking about sea power is, of course, the new battlefield. Most of you will recognize this picture from the cover of Proceedings when they were talking about the Chinese effort to revamp some of the core concepts of Mahan and what it means, marrying that then to the new delivery systems that they have been developing, and whether or not the Americans have the capability of responding. We are part of that. We need to be thinking about that. And so that the key issues, therefore, for us is really thinking about the speed of the new weapon systems. We need to be thinking about the accuracy. We also need to be thinking about redundancy. I mean, one of the greatest challenges of the numbers that the Chinese navies are now presenting to us is, instead of having to deal with a Russian Navy, where we were fairly confident that they have a limited rearming capability, they may have good weapon systems that can challenge us, but from 1989 onward, we were fairly confident that at a minimum, the Russians did not have the numbers necessary that we had to worry about the swarming efforts of large numbers. I would argue that the entry of the Chinese Navy, that of course now outnumbers any other Navy, it's not better than the American Navy, but they outnumber the Navy, and will continue to develop their capability, means that we now have to be prepared for taking casualties. We need to be prepared for the fact that in any coming conflict, we will lose ships, we will lose assets. And the question of redundancy and replacing that is something we don't want to address. And yet, if we look at what the Chinese threat is going to be posing to us, we are going to have to address it. The issue of hybrid warfare and the confusion of political elites. Look at the COVID crisis and the manner in which elites are so interested in scoring political benefit without really stopping to say what are the long-term security elements. And there are indications that part of the conversation, part of the narrative about COVID within Western societies was in fact targeted by both Russian and Chinese operations. This is something, of course, I'll give a shout out to Adam is doing in terms of information operations and how that is occurring. And that is going to further complicate what we are going to be having to face going into the future. We know that hypersonics are coming, whether or not they are quite at the level that we may be worrying today. We may take some solace in the fact that it seems that the Russians' hypersonics aren't quite as fearsome yet as we think, but I add the word yet. And once again, we don't know what the full capabilities of the Chinese and the numbers that the Chinese have. We're seeing with the Ukrainian crisis clearly the issue that the West is having difficulties thinking about replacement, new ammunition, what it means in a long drawn out war. And this is something else from a maritime perspective is going to require careful thought. The autonomous underwater vehicles, the Poseidon, is it as dangerous as people think, or some people think? Possibly. We simply don't know. The question still is, what is the Canadian response to this? Is it, again, well, we'll leave it to the Americans or the British to think about it? Or is this something that we need to be bringing into our conceptualization of sea power? Now, how do we think about it? Do we rely on a Booth? Do we rely on Hill, Mahan? how do we conceptualize, and particularly, and I remember from the discussions I used to have with my good friend Fred Krikard and with Peter Hayden and Richard Gimlet and others, the whole issue of, well, okay, how do we then translate that into a discussion for a medium power such as Canada? I dare say, of course, we may be having discussions very soon whether or not Canada even retains that capability as a medium power. And the recent embarrassment at the G20, it probably will even propel further discussion on that particular issue. We also, of course, as we all know, have difficulty coordinating with the Army and Air Force, particularly when there's such a small amount of resources to be brought forward. And quite frankly, we have the active resistance of senior government officials, PMO, DFATE. You can see wishful thinking in terms of rechanging from that awful DAC abbreviation that we use in terms of where we are moving forward. Now, once again, Booth provides us with an understanding of sea power being used for war fighting, foreign policy, constabulary. We could supersede, and once again, I would draw everyone's attention to the excellent job that the authors such as Richard Gimlet and Doug MacLean brought forward in the context of applying this theoretical framework to LEADMARC. And we, of course, know that in the Canadian context, the focus on the war fighting is always the smallest, if it's ever in existence. We focused on terrorism, we focused on piracy. I dare say we haven't really focused on anything of the coming threat that is coming forward. We do foreign policy with our forces, and we do focus on constabulary. The Canadian patrols with the American and Japanese friends and allies in the South China Sea is an indication of how is a classic cable utilization of the Navy as a foreign policy instrumentation. But once again, have we given enough focus on the war fighting? And this is where I would argue we need to be expanding our thinking. Now, when we think of Canadian maritime strategy, we tend to focus on the non-traditional and the events of the forest fires, the natural catastrophes brought on by a changing environment, of course, is top in mind. And from a political perspective, our political elites are much more comfortable talking about that than they are about war fighting. And hence we have further difficulties in terms of how we will conceptualize these particular terminologies. So what have been done? Well, the Navy, and I would argue that the Navy leads the Air Force and Army in this context, does think about it. We see the 1994 Defense White Paper starts bringing in new concepts of a post-Cold War thinking of sea power. And we start seeing the elements there. The Naval Vision of 1994 clearly is a challenge for all of us interested in the subject to start thinking and arguing about it. And we, of course, then have a Justin Course of 1997. I dare say, I suspect that many in the audience are participants in all of this process. But we get up into LEADMARC. And LEADMARC, in my mind, is one of those rare instrumentation. This was not a public affairs document. This was not something that was going to be heavy on pictures, showing how we are social engineering our military forces and highlighting very important elements by sidestepping the core issue of what are you going to be doing in a fighting environment. And the authors of LEADMARC are to be congratulated in how they actually grasp that as both an intellectual but also a policy aspect. And we can see as we go through the main elements of LEADMARC, it tells us for Canadian sea power, you need to have flexible, combat-capable blue water. Doesn't say that much of white water at that time. Of course, that has changed a little bit with the entry of the De Wolf class into the Navy. But the ability was clear. You work with the best, and you have to have the most advanced capabilities. And we see that the sea power of Canada is understood and applied immediately following it. We see how quickly we were able to respond to the attacks of 9/11 with Operation Apollo. The Navy was able to go anywhere and do anything with the Americas. We almost had to hide that fact. It was almost like we were ashamed to talk about how well we did it, but it's a clear indication of how important LEADMARC was in shaping that sea power conceptualization and pushing the strategic thought that we needed of sea power. And again, I would suggest that the success of LEADMARC then forced the Army and the Air Force to more limited degrees to do similar thinking of their own. And the Navy had a clear thought because it thought about sea power. It wasn't just about a public relation document. It was about what is the concept. So how do we now take that? How do we take the fact that the Navy knows how to do this and did it very well? And how do we take this going into the future. Well, the question is, of course, not so much can we react in terms of national environmental crisis? Well, yes, we can do that. We can do that with, of course, constabulary oriented capabilities. But the more important question in my mind is, will our ships be able to defend themselves growing with these new technologies that are coming in the possibility of a nuclear environment, and facing enemies that will have huge ammunition reload capabilities? Will we be able to sustain ourselves? Will we be able to keep in the fight? And what do we do when we actually take heavy losses? Which, once again, anyone looking at the trajectory of the coming war between the Chinese and the American Navy, that is going to be one of its major hallmarks. And so, will Canadian forces be able to fight with our allies? Will they be able, if they find themselves isolated, will they be able to defend themselves? What does that require for our coming Navy of the future? And do we have Canadian leaders, political leaders that fully understand and appreciate what we are trying to have in this particular context? And how then does Canada sustain this push for understanding sea power, but then the capability of moving forward? So where does this all take us? And this is where I'd like to just spend a little bit of time just sort of bringing all these thoughts together. Well, Canada needs to be thinking in all of its forces as we move forward. How do we fight? I'd like to make that very clear. I know it's not a politically correct statement. I know that there are many that will shy away from that and say, no, no, no. We have to learn how we are going to be able to respond in the growing fires that are coming, with earthquakes, rising sea level. Yes, we have to do all that. There's no question in my mind that we need to do that. But we can't be just thinking about that. We need to be thinking about how sea power takes us forward in what it means for the type of warfare that we can expect that will be coming from both the Russians and from the Chinese. Now, my positive view on this, so that you don't think I'm completely pessimistic on the view, is I take some solace from some of the conversations that General Van Herk has offered. And then most of you will be aware that Van Herk has been one of the most open in discussing what the new threat environment is going to look like. And of course, Van Herk's argumentation is the more that we can show that we can do this, that we understand it, that we understand the speed that is now coming in with the new delivery system. We understand that there is a tactical nuclear capability that is being introduced. We understand the numbers that the Chinese navies now bring to the fight. That if, as long as we understand and are preparing a response that our enemies understand, that of course carries into, in and of itself, a deterrent capability. And so hopefully, particularly as we watch our American allies, the Japanese, the Australians moving forward, of how they are trying to think and conceptualize and respond, that in and of itself. But it still doesn't allow Canada to sidestep the issue. We should still be part of it, because once again, we are going to be targeted, whether or not we believe somehow by having leadership that has nice socks is going to protect us in terms of how we have that ability. We need to have the capability, the collective ability to convince our enemies that we are all serious. And the other part of the matter, as we see a United States that is growing more and more politically unstable, and that's the term that we have to be honest with, as we look in terms of what is happening within their political system. We need to ensure that we also convince our allies, and the Americans in particular, that we are serious about this. As we know, we are seeing statements being made by various Republicans, and not just simply Trump. We're seeing it from DeSantis. We're seeing it from others that may, in fact, find themselves as the Republican candidate. That indicates that any discussion about a special relationship or any currency that we have had going even as recently back to our participation in the Afghanistan war, that in fact that is being forgotten by certain elements of the American leadership. And I dare say that if the Americans start getting the attitude or the belief that we are free riders, not only just on the maritime side, but on everything, you're going to be facing all of that. So Canada needs to be having a modern understanding of sea power, and it needs to be a type of understanding that is continuous. I would argue that Leadmark And those that were thinking and developing it got it right in terms of how we think, how we develop. But it needs to be an ongoing process because we are facing new elements. Yes, we can draw from the hand, we can draw from Booth, we can see the needs of what it is, but we have to be thinking about the new technologies. We need to be thinking about the new geopolitics. And ultimately, it needs to be intellectually vigorous in terms of how we are proceeding, if in fact that we are able to properly design and recapitalize to get the Canadian public to understand, yes, this is not just simply people wanting bigger toys to go play with. This is about maintaining Canadian security. And until you make that linkage in terms of what sea power means for the ultimate protection of Canadian security, we're going to be facing an uphill battle to convince our political elites or the Canadian population that ultimately has to sign on in terms of their acceptability of that. So we are in a new and a much more dangerous international environment. I dare say that we have lost some of the momentum that we had following the periods of the 1990s and 2000, when Canada was both thinking about the development of sea power, and as we saw with the development of the Halifax class, the purchase of the submarines from the British and so forth, that we were able to act upon it, and the very successful utilization on the principles established. And so I would end you with the thought that we are heading into dangerous side. The Navy will play a critical role for better or for worse. And it's impingent on all of us to be trying to facilitate this debate and discussion forward. Thank you very much. I look forward to any questions that anybody may have had of anything that I've said.
Rob, excellent as always. You've certainly whet the appetites and got us thinking about what the future could potentially look like for Canada from a maritime perspective. I'll, as I like to do, pose the first question, which goes back to one of your opening comments. You're pretty firm, I get the impression, that you expect there's going to be a, quote, hot war as opposed to the Cold War that we endured for many, many years. Do you think, or do you have in mind a particular timeline? And do you see any particular incidents, for lack of a better word, that might precipitate that kind of a scenario?
On the European front, I think the Ukrainian ability to prevent the type of victory that the Russians had in 2014 buys us time. If we look at the Russian procurement cycle and combine it with both their intent and action, the Russians seem to need about a 7 to 8 year bracket in between when they utilize force. And so, we start with Putin coming in. He came in at the end of December in 1999, and then he immediately initiates and expands the war with the Chechens. Well, it takes another 8 years before he's able to do a similar action in the context against the Georgians, and then it's approximately another 8 years in 2014 when he does it against the Ukrainians. And I think probably an internal examination means that they exhaust themselves within these conflicts, and it takes that long to go in. And I think, therefore, what we're going to be seeing at one formulation or another is a very ugly stalemate in Ukraine, but it's that recovery rate that we have to be keeping our eye on very carefully in terms of what the Russians do. And I think that probably means we've got more time than what I was fearful back in February of 2022. The Chinese are another issue, though, and we see the Chinese pushing forward in terms of both their defensive capabilities, but their offensive capabilities. I mean, I suspect many in the audience follow the discussions, debate that proceedings have been having in terms of how to visualize and think about the coming maritime battle that inevitably is going to come once the Chinese decide to invade Taiwan. And I think it's it's when, not if. I think that the Chinese, because of the economic difficulties that they are now facing right in this period, may restrain more so than they have. The problem that we have, we don't understand how active the Chinese are about sowing the social media and the cyber attacks on the Western world. I mean, in Canada, we know We don't want to know how much the Chinese have actually infiltrated our system. I mean, the reluctance to have any form of an inquiry means that they might be much more active. And if they're doing it to us, they're doing it to the Australians, they're doing it to the Japanese, they're doing it to the Americans. And so the question is, at what point do they think that we become so weak that they can seize the attack and go into Taiwan? I'm watching their amphibious capabilities right now. I don't think that they've built them right up to the stage where they think they can go in, take losses, and still have a successful invasion. But once they have that redundancy and amphibious capabilities, I think that we cross the thresholds. So I think that's the indicator. What happens to our political solidarity and what happens to their amphibious capability will be the tipping points if the Chinese think that they can go in. And so therefore, that's within a 3 to 5 year period.